highlights can be focused on particular buildings, but more importantly, I think it's the relationships that either caused or developed from the buildings. Architecture for me is really a means to relationships, and so there's a wonderful opportunity just to move into the realm of other people and what they are. When we're designing a building for a particular person or group, we're becoming those people and those groups.
Jeremy and I have been married for 35 years, so we're really got together because of architecture, because I was interested in getting into architecture, and so he came and talked to me about it as well as the rest is history. And then professionally, we've been together for the last 20 years, so it's really very easy. It's a lot easier to work together as architects than it is for me to work in another firm.
And I was fortunate enough to be the project architect for the building, and I would really like to acknowledge a number of people involved in the project who are here tonight. So first, the team, Jeremy Sturgess for his inspired design of the building.
The Water Centre for us was, 5 years from sort of start to finish in terms of planning it, working through the design with the client, all of the various issues that we had to resolve in terms of the sustainable options that we wanted to choose. Basically, we were working with the waterworks and wastewater engineers, and they really, really embraced all of the ideas we had, especially the aesthetics. I mean, I think it was a bit of a challenge for some of them at first. Waterworks and wastewater had never really been in the same building together. Now, with modern techniques, they can work in the same building. So a lot of the work that we did was not only developing the architecture for them, but developing a building and locating the floors or the big stair and the big atrium as a place where everybody could come together, because they'd literally never worked all in the same building together. It's sort of the manifestation of the change, I guess, in their department. So, but I know Jeremy feels, and I think it's true. It's really like designing a big house. It just happens to be a building for 700 people.
For the Water Centre, we've turned to music. Live music has always been for me an essential part of my creative process. I've consistently been inspired by the music of Lorna McLaughlin. We commissioned Lorna to write water music to commemorate this remarkable design process and to symbolically thank all of the members of the Water Centre staff who worked so hard with us to achieve what we are celebrating tonight.
The original principle of the building, the reason it's a long, thin building, is to maximize the elevations on the south and the north. And the idea of the curve from the north is to protect the site in terms of, wind, and to sort of basically make that wall and the roof as one single element. So the south is more open, has all the glass, although you can control the sun with the big overhang of the roof. But they're very, very different sides of the building. And the south is, slanted glass, and the north has these more punched sort of studio windows. A lot of people see it like a wave. And I mean, that honestly wasn't the original intent, but I think that's really what's wonderful about architecture. When it starts to develop those symbols or ideas that people can kind of grab onto, or they can interpret them in their own way as well. I guess, frankly, for Calgary, it was maybe a little bit radical. I mean, we don't obviously see it that way. And now that it's been there for a couple of years, I think people have really embraced it.
I had moved here as a teenager with my family, and then gone to University of Toronto for school, and then come back. And it was clearly a very suburban-oriented city, and I was compelled to sort of bring some of that culture that I had been immersed in Toronto to Calgary. My continuing goal that started then and has maintained ever since was to try and make the city more urban. People ask me how many houses I've designed in Calgary, and I don't know. I'm afraid to count, but I'm sure there's over 100. And I developed pretty early on an understanding for two typologies in Calgary that I had seen form the kind of residential architecture of the city. Calgary is a city of bluffs and valleys created by the rivers. And people historically built in the river valleys and did so in houses that were hunkered down with porchy fronts and cozy California bungalow cottages that created a very attractive streetscape. But then in the probably as early as the 40s and then certainly through the 50s and 60s, the kind of unabashed wealth of the risk-taking oil men started to develop on the bluffs. These were people saying, I can withstand the winds and the environment and take advantage of the remarkable views. And that was a modern architecture, and those buildings really, I think, proudly expressed a kind of a new spirit.
I think there's probably, 3 or 4 projects that are my favorite projects. And one of them is this house. We've designed 3 or 4 houses together for ourselves, so it's always the one that you're in, and it certainly fits very well.
I suppose this house reflects some of my basic ideas about, I don't want to belittle it, but about efficiency. And I'm not an efficiency freak, but I don't like waste. I always tell my clients that I'm quite happy to spend their money, but I don't want to waste a penny of it. And I think this house should not be any bigger and could not be any smaller. And so I think it's achieved a kind of perfection for who we are within that context. I do think you need spaces for different moods, but I believe that you can achieve a particular kind of isolation in a chair, and you don't need a room to give you that. The kitchen is designed so that it's all about how either Lesley prepares a meal when I'm cleaning up and dealing with the dogs, or it's about us doing something together if there's half a dozen people coming for dinner, or with the back pantry, it's the way people can help us look after a crowd of 100 people. There's no doors, there's no shut-off, but there's just places to have some distance when necessary, and there's places for real community most of the time. We had just come back from a trip to Stuttgart and looked at particularly work of JJP Aud. We came back and with that experience in my head, Jacqueline Battistella came to us and said, I have this site. And she said, Jeremy, what can we do? My only criteria are that there are no front drive garages, and I want to show you a painting that I have that I received from my sister who just died, called The Tangled Garden. With this Aud project that had so inspired me in the back of my mind, we came up with this idea of building 2 blocks of houses, one on the street and one on the lane. We then said I wanted to build the units on the street with basement suites so that you could build in the community and create housing in the community that would allow people to live there their whole life. The other thing about the building that is about community is the courtyard, and the courtyard is the kind of outside living space for all of the surrounding units. By being on the sidewalk as well and separated by a low wall and a gate, it's kind of the territory of the condominium group, but it's also something that contributes back to the neighborhood, because everybody who's walking by gets to participate a little bit in that tangled garden that we planted inside in memory of Jacqueline's sister.
Well, I was just wondering if we did a wing wall that's masonry.
Like
As an
old,
option.
like a historic kind of firewall.
Jeremy's approach to architecture is that sort of everything is about architecture. It's sort of all-encompassing. I think what's very admirable is his determination to keep his hand in design. So it's an approach to life, because you're always thinking about space or thinking about design or how you would redesign something and improve it. But that carries through, obviously, to the projects as well.
It implied that that's where you would put a table, as opposed to something over here that implies there's nothing there. I think that's... Getting involved in the building block was a real opportunity, albeit modestly approached, to sort of re-establish an actual area of the city. 11th Avenue had been known as Electric Avenue. It had gone through a highlight and then gone way downhill to a point where it was almost Skid Row. And 4 of us got together and bought the buildings. And in renovating the buildings into a kind of focused retail, we really encouraged a particular kind of retail tenant. It was so logical to me that this area of the city between the kind of popular retail of 17th Avenue and downtown, right in the middle of it, not a very long distance, was an opportunity waiting to happen. And a district was born. And I think it bred a whole sort of new culture for the street through I guess, some focused attention, but not a lot of resources. The Grand was a remarkable piece. It had been built in 1911 with the Lougheed. The Grand was built first, and I was struck that in 1911 the visionaries at the time determined that a theater could not stand on its own piece of property without the assistance of an office building in a mixed-use context. And so here we were almost 100 years later, and that theater was going to be demolished for a parking lot. We could take it back and turn it into a contemporary theater. It had been renovated over the years. There was quite a significant renovation in the 1940s, and then there was another renovation into movie theaters in the 1970s. We took a kind of a archaeological photograph of what we saw, subjectively throwing away some bits and keeping some bits, and froze those all in time so that you have a kind of an eclectic mix as you experience the space of various histories through Calgary's time. And it's interesting because I think it does create, again in a microcosmic sense, what Calgary's been through. Calgary is a boom and bust town, and there's an unabashed kind of rejection of anything that's old and a real celebration of the new, and we've demolished lots and lots of stuff. I think you can read that with what we've done with the Grand.
We won the competition, international competition, to design what was then known as the Bow Valley Centre, and it became the Bridges once the city had begun to develop and market the sites. It's the site of the former General Hospital.
The opportunity was to, on a large piece of land very close to downtown, in an old and kind of forlorn neighborhood, to say that new development could turn that neighborhood around from its sort of stagnant situation and bring it into something exemplary in the city.
We won because we basically took the major open space, which was about a third of the area that we were given, and placed it in the middle, and then we placed the buildings all around.
We came to the conclusion that if we could commemorate what was a very negative thing in everybody's minds, the loss of the hospital, into something very positive, the creation of a park on the footprint of the hospital, we could reconnect the community with the park. And then secondly, we could create a series of residential types so that the community could become a microcosm of the city. This is something, again, very important to me, that every neighborhood in the city, suburban and urban, has to have room in it for every type of people, rich, poor, old, young, firm and infirm. And if we can do that, and if we can have them living and working in the neighborhood and have them able to walk to work or take transit or whatever, we can start to really build sustainability. And so we said, let's bring it back and make it a community park where the community kids would play soccer and where residential units could overlook the park so that there was a real sense of connection and security, and we could locate a new community building on the edge of the park.
Our office designed the community center. It's set up as in two sections. There's one side which is fully built and occupied, and the other side is sort of a shell, recognizing that as the population doubles in size, which is basically what's going to happen, they could actually take that wing of the building over and fill it in and develop, additional space for themselves. It's really starting to come into its own in terms of the new housing around the park, but also that the park is really available for the whole community. It's certainly a much better use than a big parking lot in the middle of a community. So that's really wonderful to come back and kind of see a space where, you've been drawing and imagining this sort of space in your mind, and then you come in and it's just full of people. That's really a wonderful part about what we do. One project that we're very excited about right now is the redevelopment of the LRT downtown on 7th Avenue, which is the major connecting hub for all of the LRT in Calgary. And we're replacing all of the stations and platforms in conjunction with another firm. So what we did with the stations was replace all the canopies, and developed a number of canopy sections that are very light steel and glass roofs. They have a lot more transparency than they had before. So we raised all the sidewalks and connected the platforms directly to the buildings that they front onto. And then we also developed the landscaping system that connects it, so it's much more of a pedestrian avenue than it ever was. It was a real trick to develop the station canopy so that you ended up with lots of place for passengers to get on and off, but also still had a wide enough sidewalk behind. And you allowed these buildings still to function. So we went back to Chisenji this past fall. Jeremy and I hadn't been there for, I guess, about 20 years. And originally I worked with Jeremy on the project when I was still a student, and we took our two children there. So it was very nostalgic. I'd actually never seen the building. He'd been back and seen the building once before, but it was just absolutely magical. I mean, there was still staff there that remembered us.
It's amazing how those relationships do really become like family. Going back this time, 19 years later, there was no pressure. And so for the first time, we were really able to be in Japan as tourists, but also as tourists who had left a mark in Japan.
The building has aged really gracefully. It's pretty amazing to see. It's very popular. It was full of tourists. There's a very special garden there, so it's quite a sight in this town, which is a lot like Lake Louise or Banff. Quite wonderful to see it.
We didn't buy it anywhere.
Something that's happened, I think, particularly with the houses we've designed over the years, is that the houses have created relationships, and the relationships have particularly resulted in the fact that all of our friends are really people that we've designed houses for. A real sort of example of that is Dan and Fran McDonald, who knew us before we designed their first house, and were very nervous when they came to us that should they hire us, because they wouldn't want to sully a good relationship. I was quite determined to use this copper-colored metal on the roof, which I think was quite a stretch for you. And I don't know whether you ever really agreed to it or were just being nice and you guys have never been interested in anything showy at all. You like things to be very subtle, and I think you were concerned that this would not be subtle, and it probably isn't.
Well, I suppose our eyes were just opened. I guess it's like anything. When
Part of the program, because of the remarkable both generosity and intimate privacy of Dan and Fran is that they love people to come and stay with them, but they love them to stay at a distance. And so it was really about making two houses, two very small houses, one about 1,200 square feet, one about 600 square feet, and connect them in some way so that you could protect from the rain. When the rain is here, it might be warm, and so you could still eat outside in a rainstorm, and create a cleft in the rock that then carried you into the entry, and then you walk in, and the house with its soaring roofs and soaring to either end in a kind of a unlimited way is really about the incredible views to the mountains. Taking Fran and Dan on this journey from traditional to contemporary, if we can use those terms loosely, was really about their trust in me that contemporary wouldn't be stainless steel and concrete and glass. It needed to be warm and cozy, and so this house is, as much as it's very efficient and as much as Fran and Dan live in a very kind of non-cluttered way, it needed to be rich with wood and the warmth of the view.
My first real recollection of the design process is when the four of us were out here walking around the property, and I explained to you that the house had to be built at the top of that outcrop. And after an hour or so, you said, no, well, that's not the way it's going to work. What we're going to do is blast a space down through this rock, and then we can get to a lower part, sort of saddle on the property closer to the water.
We could build a long, narrow building parallel to this wall of rock and create something that was kind of the rock and of the landscape.
I could have wandered around this lot for the next 100 years and never been able to see that. Immediately it just made sense.
With Fran and Dan, I've really found a kind of a thesis that my job is to give people the means to find out more about themselves and to find out what they're capable of. And often, as I say, they're challenging me with new ideas.